I'm sorry, can you name one?
Hi there, I seem to be having a little trouble clicking on this morning. So good morning, everybody. I want to do class a little differently today because that's allergies, by the way. I was sneezing all day yesterday. I'm not, I'm not contagious to myself or others. No, what I wanted to do with class today is do a little bit differently, but I want to start out by apologizing for running away last week. We had some good things happen as a result of a council meeting on a consulting project I'm doing, and it, as so often happens when good things move forward, there's you have to like emergently respond to them. So we were having a little public engagement, social media launch, like emergency meeting. So we had most of it in order. So what's happening? I just thought I'd just tell you what I'm working on that project is trying to move some affordable housing forward in the village of Kaslo. And since I moved back here, I think I was on the board of the Housing Society for the full term, and the last couple of years I've been consulting with them, just focusing on getting a rental project going. So it's something that I feel like I've been working on for ages. And one of the challenges with affordable housing in Kaslo, as in many rural communities, is that there's not a lot of land that is serviced. So you see, it is relevant to today's topic, which is land use and transportation. So we're anyway to put okay, something's happening here. I just had a funny echo, but it's quit. So in order to really to get housing funding in the province for affordable rental housing, you have to have a service lot, and there aren't very many of those in Kaslo. And transportation even comes into it because, of course, you have to find a service lot that will allow you to provide parking, which is the most land consumptive thing we do around here, is provide parking for everyone. And for those of you who are in the planning stream, you have probably talked about parking requirements before, and I can understand, just on the even on the micro scale, right, of this housing project, the first sort of call to neighbors, we have to call the neighbors all around this proposed project. Of course, the first call is the right next door neighbor, friend of mine. It's like, where will they park? Where will the new residents park? Because of course Kaslo is a tourist place, and parking in the summer is always crazy. So our lives are so often affected by our land use system and our transportation choices. And I have segued from my housing project public engagement into today's topic. This is going to be a different deal. I'm going to kind of, so what I'm wanting to do today with the class time is have a lecture where you guys have a chance to actually talk. But I realized before I launch into this, or I've been thinking about this lecture and what we're going to talk about, I realized I need to say that again, I did love those stories, and I want to thank you for the way that you approached that assignment. Because one of the challenges for me with online learning is creating the kind of space where there's enough relationship that you can go ahead and do something a little bit adventurous or something you like care about. And for me, that requires a level of trust, and I thank you. So, and I've just been thinking about how we can use those in the context of the final assignment. You know, I had put in the syllabus that I was going to share them right away with everybody, and we were going to like upvote and choose a few as a class. And I realized that was a bad idea. That's not going to work, because the way they are is you've already been thinking ahead to your own project. So they're not multi-purpose scenarios in that sense. Some of them are really for food, and some of them are really for Prince George, which makes them, it just means that the idea that I had about how they were going to be was wrong. And so I have to rethink, and I'm sure you guys have already been thinking about how you're going to use them in the final assignment. I do want them to be shared, so so that we can use different aspects, because if you think about the different approaches that people took, thinking about the food system group, like Hannah and Patrick and that group. So they brought up a scenario in which water security was a big issue. Somebody else might want to think about water security in their scenario. So I would like us to be able to borrow ideas back and forth. You don't have to have a scenario in which everyone in Prince George dies of heavy metal poisoning, but think about whether or not, you know, how you would prioritize water security in your scenario would be useful way for us to use those interchangeably. So in summary, actually I can't summarize yet. You know, in the Prince George Sustainability Plan, there was a set of scenarios also done for Prince George, which some of you might have seen already. They're using two dimensions, the sort of how much climate change and how cooperative the people are in finding solutions. So those, I think, will be useful to at least a couple of the groups. So we might want to sort of populate the scenario mix a bit more. But in summary, I'm still thinking about how exactly that's going to how we're going to all use those. So, but I can tell that you guys are all thinking about the final assignment, and that's good. And so I was trying to think about the most efficient way to kind of bring everybody up to speed a little bit on the rather vast area of land use and transportation as it relates to sustainability. So I've got some nice up-to-date materials in terms of, you know, national best practices right now on land use and transportation for readings. And I want us to at least think about the Prince George Transit Future Plan, part of the reason that, you know, I find these like minor or incremental goals to be kind of depressing from a sustainability perspective. The Transit Future Plan is that transit ridership in Prince George will double. It's hard to tell the whole context of that, but that's not a very ambitious goal, since the current you know, market share of transportation is 2%. Doubling ridership, it sounds ambitious, but it actually doesn't get you very much market share. So anyway, so there's those kinds of readings, and I'll go through the readings and the assignment again at the end of my lecture today. Okay, so let me just get this ready to share. And I am going to ask you guys to tell me some more stories today, you know, about your experiences of land use and transportation. And I'm going to tell you some of my stories about land use and transportation, because when you say you're interested in land use, that's an easy way to get some space by yourself at the party, usually. So I actually find this fascinating stuff, and I try to make it, you know, something that everyone can understand. I know you guys are from some different backgrounds, and some of you are already excited about land use and transportation. But now you're going to be more excited. Okay, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat room, but it doesn't work very well when I have my there. Okay. Okay. So, sort of think, what are the questions around land use and transportation? Well, the first one is I want to bring everybody up to speed. What is a land use pattern? And what effects do land use patterns and transportation systems have on quality of life and on GHG emissions? How do land use patterns affect transportation choice? And what are the systems that affect land use patterns? Like what makes big box stores? What makes giant parking lots? What makes, you know, in Prince George you have those roads with like baby roads beside them. What makes those patterns? What makes the roads have baby roads? What system changes are necessary to change a land use pattern and impact transportation options? So to me, that's the territory of the questions, and you can think about your own questions in this, as you know, because again, it seems abstract, so you need to go at it with some questions. So this is how I'm going to go through my introduction to what admittedly is like a vast territory. An introduction to land use. We're going to talk a little bit about transportation choice. I'm going to try to get you to talk about your choices and when you've made different ones. And then what actually affects or determines land use. And once we know that, we can sort of talk about what systems, interventions, and here I've got change land use planning. That should be change land use. And then talk about some new models in land use planning. Don't don't let me forget to tell you about Euclid, Ohio. So what is a land use pattern? Well, I've put, a nice little map from the PG mapping utility here, where I've actually pulled up the land use zoning map and put it on top of the road and parcel fabric. But just in a general way, you can see that there's a pattern that you can read from this. And if you're transportation oriented, you can see how the airport connects to the city, how it connects to the industrial lands. You can see how the intersection of the two highways is kind of weird in Prince George, but you can see that there's a transportation intersection that is part of the reason that that you have that assembly of land uses there. The river intersection is part of the reason that the city is located there. So you can start to just look at the map and start to go, okay, what are the relationships between, for example, the rail yards and the commercial center? What's the relationship between the university and the commercial center? It's also a land use question to me. And sort of what are the, how are the natural areas distributed in the residential areas? And I was looking at the floodplain again on this mapping utility. And, looking at the 2010 floodplain mapping on this. That's what I do for fun. But a land use pattern is an ordering, whether it's zoned, like this one represents what people would like to be there, and there's other maps that show what actually is there in terms of where the residential neighborhoods are and where the commercial facilities are. Hey, I can tell you about Euclid, Ohio. One of the reasons I make that that distinction between zoning and actual land use pattern. I used to teach planning law in the States, and so that includes a bunch of Supreme Court decisions of people, typically people suing against infringement of their property rights for this regulatory thing or other. And you may have come across the term in your reading in other classes, if you're a planner, the term Euclidean zoning. And when I first encountered that term, and part of the reason I tell this story is when I first encountered that term, I was thinking, what is it sort of mathematical? Is it geometric? But the term Euclidean zoning, which means where you zone into single family, multifamily, commercial, these colors are a system of Euclidean zoning. That is named after the town of Euclid, Ohio, and a US Supreme Court decision, which said that telling someone that their property was in a single family zone, and therefore they could only build in conformance, that was a legally constitutionally defensible regulatory interest. Now that's all in the US context. Every time, obviously I shouldn't say too much here, but what's even more interesting is the town of Euclid was a suburb of Cleveland, and there was a big transportation corridor, and the land uses there were what you'd expect along a big transportation corridor between an industrial city and a working suburb, is that those were the existing uses were warehouses and other kinds of service buildings. And the town of Euclid put single family zoning on this piece of property that had this commercial industrial use. And last time I checked, there were still no single family houses there. It was still in its use prior to zoning. So I just love that the one, the Supreme Court decision that you read about that enabled planning in the United States also is a good illustration of its kind of limitations. You can't make somebody build a single family home on their warehouse site through zoning. So there's this sort of, you can keep them from doing anything else, but you can't make them change. So that's one of the interesting things about, this is a zoning map. So it doesn't actually necessarily mean that those are the actual land use patterns. I have too much fun with this. I realize I'm nowhere near as far as I want it to be. So a land use pattern is, can be a pattern of land use zoning, like the one I just looked at. It's also a pattern of titled lots and road and transportation allowances. So there's this legal underlay of land use titles that is invisible, but more permanent than once it's established in this kind of density, it's more permanent than any other kind of layer. And we'll talk about why that is. And then there's that pattern of actual land uses. So I want to tell a little story of where the land use pattern comes from, which those of you who are, some of you will recognize this kind of story from geography, and some of you from your other land use planning classes. But where does it actually come from? It's this sort of layering over time. And so I'm going to tell a story about another piece of land that I worked on with the housing in Kaslo, which is it's an interesting story. So this is, welcome to Kaslo. It's overall, the land use plan, the land use pattern is that this is our little adorable downtown right here, this block, that's downtown. This is called Lower Kaslo, which is, it's all houses and old heritage churches, and this is Upper Kaslo, there's a hill here. Since its inception, it started out as a mining town, and obviously, Silver Rush, I shouldn't say obviously, but it started out in the Silver Rush. It had electricity, Kaslo and Sandon had electricity, at least probably before Victoria, somewhere in there, it was a big city at one time. This Kaslo River used to run through the middle of town until there were some serious floods. And so now there's a dike, so that right now the river runs over to the side. One of the things that's funny about that is in the original survey, you could see these tiny little lots here. There's tiny little lots surveyed all across this golf course and this river, and there's these just tiny little 50-foot lots that establish parcels of land that people have title to all across up this hill. They're just everywhere. So there's kind of a, if you were trying to sort of alter land use in Kaslo, you have these tiny little lots to deal with everywhere. Kaslo's recently leapt forward into the 1930s by putting in a sewer system on a couple of streets and around this bay, which is part of this story. Within the last 20 years, and in the last couple of years, Kaslo did a second street of sewer downtown. So the rest of this whole little dense little town on what those of you who are into physical geography, you can tell that it's going to be sitting on some big riverine outwash kinds of rocks. So these people are all on septic, and here we have this beautiful lake. So there'd be a lot of sewer under the bridge in this town. Now, the actual land use pattern I want to just talk about is this. I'm going to focus in not on this piece of land, which is, there's another story about how the lots outlined in yellow are one thing. These lots outlined in yellow are currently for sale. So if you have $2.5 million and not a very good understanding of environmental contamination, this could be yours. So that's an oddly shaped lot, isn't it? And you can see there's a road there. There's a park here. So we got a park, and this is where the Jazz Fest happens, is in this part of the bay and this park. It's not exactly right next to town. It's a little bit of a hike down that hill. And then you can just see one little building right there where my cursor is. So where does this shape of lot come from? And why are these things here? Well, we have to start with the railroad, transportation. So it's kind of a steep bank, and initially there's a steep hillside. So initially we have the ore coming down from the mines, and we have to get them onto the boat, which is part of the railway system. So the ore comes down the hill and then winds around to try to, railways can only be just so much slope. So it winds around through town, comes down onto this relatively flat bench. You can turn around your ore cars here, and then you take them back down onto the boat. So if you think about that shape, that's railway line shape. And then we have this nice railway line here surveyed in. So what do you suppose we have around where the railway line is? Well, that's a great place to locate other industrial facilities right there where you can load your ore cars right on. So we have a smelter and the Kootenay Ore Company right beside the railway. And then we have a sawmill right there on that beautiful beach. And those two maps, by the way, those are survey maps. So those establish property lines. So they establish those weird shapes that you see in the first photo. So there's the railway line coming down around the hill and over onto the top of the site comes along here. And then there's where you would turn your ore cars around. And there's where you go down to what was the railway wharf right there. And this is where that sawmill was. And this is where that Kootenay Ore Company had a part of their, Kootenay Ore Company had a place there, but the main part of that smelter operations were actually over here, where there's a big hole that you can hardly see in the picture. So along around, this is sort of the early 2000s. Someone acquires this property around the same time as Kaslo is building, well, not coincidentally, Kaslow's first sewer line goes all along here because this was seen as a fabulous, we could become the next Lake Tahoe or something by having this dense condo development. Each one of these is a 3-unit condo development that's proposed. And there's a kind of zoning in the village that's waterfront commercial, would kind of allow these. although the village at the time didn't really have the planning capacity it needed. So this engineer comes in and says he's going to do all these things, which would have required a massive amount of village investment in upgrading that sewer line that they just built. And we're going to have all these condos, and we're going to have a lot of people buy them. And the engineer slash entrepreneur actually invested $6 million in the pre-development work in the site and on that other piece of land that's currently for sale. And this is what we have now. It's there's two buildings there actually. You can see the one in the bottom picture. They got to, you can see that it got to windows and siding. And then in the top picture is the second building where they didn't get to windows and siding. So if you think about, okay, the plan was, and the plan and kind of the zoning was developed to allow for this kind of thing. And then this one here and this one here were built. Sorry, this one here and this one here. The reason it's important is because the guy also promised to change the land titles, and one of these buildings is actually on two different land titles. So it's illegal. This one, the less finished one, and this one. And so there it is, 2008 happened. He couldn't get any more money from his investors, investors wanted their money, went into foreclosure sale, which is one investor trying to get money out of the other investor, initially for $6 million. And then about 2 years ago, the price was reduced to $2 million. And we had a look at the buildings as the Housing Society when we like, hey, we could maybe make some affordable housing out of those. That, if the whole thing is $2 million, maybe we can find some other people to go in with this on some of this other stuff. But of course, you have brownfield here, a brownfield here, two buildings. There's another hilarious land use story here. And in the process of foreclosure, this marina and boathouse structures, they've all been destroyed. So we no longer have that sort of stuff over there. And it was a very complicated deal, and it would have taken a lot to put together. But we worked on it pretty hard for a while, trying to find partners, because there's a lot of people that would actually like to see that land reclaimed and some useful use made of it. And we came to a point where we were on our second offer. We'd had a property assessment in, we'd done an environmental contamination review, but the uncertainty about how much money you'd have to put in to fix that, we were definitely below the asking price. And the investors, who are from Ontario, just, I think, couldn't imagine that this land couldn't bring $2.5 million here. But land use and economics are very much tied together. And so when we're thinking about what makes land use patterns, well, they come from initial property line allocations and land use and transportation infrastructure. They come from historic events like floods and fires. That'll change people's pattern of land use. And they come from this layering of old use. That should be the other way. New uses get layered onto old uses. If the financing and the legal infrastructure and the economic conditions are, all those systems help to create a land use pattern. So then, if you think about, I mean, think about where you live right now. I know not all of you are in Prince George. You know, some of you are in Calgary. Some are in other communities. So this land use pattern, what impacts does it have on the community? So in the Kaslo case, we have a huge, beautiful piece of, you know, brownfield lakeshore land that is stuck in foreclosure, which also means that we have more space for trails as a community. What impacts does that land use pattern have on the community? Well, to me, in places like Prince George, in places like Calgary, in places like Vancouver, it's going to affect what your transportation options are, because it's going to affect the cost of transit, the cost of having a car. So you have to think, when you're making those choices, you are in your brain thinking about how much money and how much time. And again, kind of abstract, but again, not really on a daily basis. Am I going to be a transit rider in Prince George means that I'm going to have to live pretty close to transit, learn that schedule so I'm not waiting 45 minutes. It affects your transportation choice. Or do I make the investment in having a car, in which case I've got a whole lot of sunk costs anyway. So then, you know, those are how people make choices about transportation. I think I'll just take my car. The little bit extra it's going to cost me for gas, you know, it's going to save me a lot of time. But it also has an impact on neighborhood feel very much. So again, that Ospika Boulevard, Tabor Boulevard, what's the feel of that part of Prince George? What's the feel of the older parts of Prince George? What's the feel of a denser neighborhood versus the feel of a more spread out neighborhood? I really like the feel of denser neighborhoods, and have lived in places where I thought it would be a nuisance to have a car. I mean, just couldn't imagine having a car or needing a car. I think land use pattern is going to affect your health habits, because if you just go from house to car to if you're going to go from house to car to parking lot, then, you know, all your exercise is going to be in the mall. So that can affect your overall life status versus someone who regularly walks as a form of transportation in their daily life. And it's going to affect your the social fabric. And I really experienced that living in Italy, really. I've never lived in shouldn't say that. I've lived in Los Angeles, I've lived in Seattle, I've lived in some fairly dense neighborhoods in those places, Louisville, of course, Calgary, Winnipeg. Land use pattern affects how many people you're going to meet. I mean, are you gonna even see your neighbors? Are you going to meet people on the street? So back to, I figured I'd better say, okay, and I talked a little bit about how land use is regulated. The regulation of land use is a municipal or local authority. They have the authority to regulate it, although individuals determine what they're going to do in that context of those regulations. But then there's a bunch of interacting systems. So land use planning is the mechanism through which governments control investments in roads, sewer, water, and other infrastructure to direct growth. So actually that's land use planning and capital planning, which you'll see in the Prince George materials that you read this week. So obviously my voice needs a little bit of a break. So just thinking about how you make transportation choices in relation to where you live. Have you ever lived anywhere where you made very different transportation choices than you do where you live now? So can you contrast that? I'm going to try to make this where I can see if someone is volunteering to talk.
Do you want us to go now?
Yes, please.
Is there any echo in my talking, or is it okay?
There's no echo.
Okay. I mean, I guess I've had a fairly stark contrast in my transportation choices since 2 weeks ago I moved from Prince George back to Nelson, so I'm not far from Caslow. And I think I filled up my gas tank in Kamloops on the drive back here, and my tank's at just about empty, and that was 2 weeks ago. So since moving back, I barely drive. And when I was in Prince George, I drove a lot. Like to get up to the university, I had to go up the hill, or just to get to groceries. Everything's a lot more spread out in the area. And I find, even though Nelson is uphill both ways, it's easier for me to walk to places. I don't have to deal with traffic and the weird streets there in Nelson. I can just walk down the hill and I'm at where I need to be. And then the location I'm at in Nelson is fairly central as well. So I'm sort of in the middle of downtown and some of the grocery stores. So which has been really nice to not drive as much. I've seen people on the street that I know since coming back and just having little chats, and I was really looking forward to that and coming back here and driving less. So that's been my experience the last couple of weeks.
And you know, I don't know how many of you have been to Nelson, but it has a lovely, you know, that same mining town land use pattern kind of in Nelson. It has a very dense downtown, and a bit of a crazy real estate market, so that there's some of the houses uphill. They were built as rather large houses, and many of them are occupied by 2 or 3 or 4 households. So the house my son lives in, I think it has half a dozen households. It's owned by one of the older landlords. It's pre-gentrified. It's definitely not a gentrified house, but there's a lot of people that live in that one house. So when you get that kind of, you know, more people there, you know, there's corner grocery stores, there's cafes, there's actually people on the street. If you can find a place to live, which if you've got if you got a relative there, that's good, because it's really tough. So Cameron's got a comment in the well, I'll tell the story. So when I was teaching in Iowa State, I got to teach in the Rome program. So I got to go live in Rome 3 summers. Now that's not really like living in a place. You don't make all the same choices that you do about how much rent you can afford, and therefore how much rent plus transportation can you afford, and therefore where will you live? Because we had some of that subsidized. But I lived in this neighborhood. This isn't a great picture. of it because this is the main drag in Trastevere. And so it's got these tiny little streets with these 6-story walk-ups. Yes, that's true. You go get your groceries, and then you walk up a hill, and then you walk up 6 flights of stairs. So you don't buy Costco amounts of toilet paper. So it affects all your choices, and sometimes you just you go down to one of those little restaurants, in part because you don't want to haul all those groceries up the stairs. But there's all these little cafes, but the commuting part was always very interesting to me, because if you're able to live, the density of Rome is such that there's trams go by every 5 minutes. So you never have that feeling like you do in a sort of a prairie town bus system where you're like running to the bus as hard as you can, because if you miss it, it's going to be an hour. So, but no, you can just sort of sashay down to the tram stop, and if one's just leaving, well, there'll be another one along. And so commuting it by transit is like really easy if you live in the center city. You can see there's still a whole lot of cars, and plus there's these motorini everywhere, Vespas. So for me, the other part of the transportation choice, I know a lot of Romans can't afford to live that close, so there's all these little cars and stuff, but the cars are tiny because there's like no parking anywhere. And the Vespas are a big transportation mode of choice, again, because you can park them anywhere. So a lot of people use those. One of the other interesting land use things is we have this is a dedicated transit corridor, and you can see cars are in it anyway. And then at night, it gets used by other forms of transportation. Like there's no sort of single-use land in a city like Rome. But in terms of what transportation mode am I going to choose, I'm going to think about, is it convenient? Is it accessible? Is it low cost? And in this environment, it would cost more and be less convenient to have your own car. With the exception that for there's quite a few people for whom the rent plus transportation expense still means it's cheaper for them to have a car, even though it's going to be hard to park. So in Rome, I'm a transit user. How many of you have, like, who has flown into Calgary and flown into Vancouver? Can compare that in terms of mode choice.
I don't know. I didn't really like flying into Calgary. It's pretty limiting. Mind you, I was on a layover, so I didn't really get a chance to explore anything outside of the airport area. I mean, they put me up in a nice posh hotel. They shuttled me. That was when Air Canada, one of the times Air Canada was having a ton of issues. So essentially they overbooked my flight. I was flying back to Fort St. John, so they diverted me through Calgary, which added an entire day to my trip. So I was lucky to fly into to Calgary. So Vancouver is a lot nicer, I think, flying in. The coastal mountains are there, the water is right there, but I grew up there, so I'm probably pretty biased in that regard, to be honest. Flying into LAX is interesting, though. It's a little off, but when the pilot says we've now entered Los Angeles, and it takes about 15 minutes to fly from the boundary of Los Angeles to LAX. And then you're looking out and all you're seeing is sprawl, houses, lots of pools. it's pretty crazy because, I mean, you're flying at probably 400 kilometers an hour, and it takes about 15 minutes to transition the boundary of Los Angeles to actually get in formation to land at the airport. So that left a mark on me. I think the first time I flew into LA, to realize just how large it is, and that how sprawled it is, and that everybody relies on their own cars there. Because if you lived in Los Angeles, you know that the buses are relatively unsafe. I think there's a crash 2 or 3 times a week with city transit there. So most people, if they have a car, they opt to drive.
When I lived in Los Angeles, and I know when I first gave the airport example, I was actually thinking about how you choose your next transportation mode, right? Because for me, when you fly into Calgary and you have to get on an infrequent bus to get to the LRT, I'm just like, what
Right.
am I thinking?
Yeah, I took a shuttle. They shuttled me. So I guess, sorry, in that I missed that. I'm sorry. In that context, I don't really have a really good example. From LA though, it's driving. Like I don't know. I've been in and out of that airport a lot of times and never once taken any other mode of transportation, because the idea of taking a bus on the 405 is insane. And yeah, Vancouver, I mean, now they have the SkyTrain that goes right there. It's pretty straightforward. And if you're, flying again to, you say, downtown Victoria, they shuttle you right to the South Terminal, and you get to get on a pretty skookum little seaplane and fly into downtown Victoria. And that is amazing because you get out right at the Empress and you're in downtown. You don't even need to drive anywhere. You're just right on foot. I never have, but if you're one of those people staying at the Empress, it's across the street. It's pretty sweet. It's a pretty awesome experience. Like, I think transportation from air terminals from Vancouver and Victoria are pretty good.
And you mentioned, so I don't know. So anyway, when I lived in LA, my roommate was going to academic job interviews. And so she had to go to the airport like about every 2 weeks. And so from our neighborhood where we lived, on the freeways, it was about, like maybe 40 minutes to the airport. But I used to drive her because, of course, how else are you going to get there? But we could take the carpool lanes, and so that gets you like 6 or 8 stories above some of the. Anyway. But I did also ride transit in LA because my son was of an age. I guess not everybody's sons are of an age where they really like buses, but that's what he liked. He really liked buses. And so it's kind of funny because my professors at the time were some of the only pro-sprawl planning professors in like, and the only ones I know. And there I was, with my son. And they'd occasionally, one of these guys, I was in a class with him and I had to bring my son. It's another story. But anyway, he'd offer us a ride and Ken would be like, no, I want to take the bus. We hardly ever get to take the bus. So anyway, so that can affect your transit choice if your small son is a bus enthusiast. So Patrick, the other Patrick, did you have your hand up? Did you mean to have your hand up? Okay.
No, it was just, when you asked about flying into both, I just put my hand up to say, yes, I have.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, if I can, because when flying was a thing, I find, if you fly into Chicago, you don't have to get a car. If you fly, there's lots of places where you can visit without having to have a car. Ryan.
Hi. Hi, Tara. I'm sort of just jumping into this conversation about halfway, but just listening to you talk about traveling to different places and the different transportation systems that exist. I think I was most blown away when I traveled to Seoul in South Korea. And you know, being a foreigner traveling there who had no idea of how to speak Korean or anything, but just to be like amazed at how sophisticated their public transportation system was and how easy it was to navigate for me as somebody who only spoke English was, it was just, I still can't get over it. And I just sort of, I just posted a link to a picture of their subway map. I think it's like 11 different lines and 7 different layers of underground subway. And like, there's just trains coming every 2 minutes. And it's just so efficient and it's so, it was just amazing. And it just made me really like want to advocate more for public transportation or having infrastructure prepared for increased use of public transportation because it can be so well done that you don't need to have a car.
It can, and that's it's almost, you know, people, we think, when you think about what people express around their values around their automobile, it's freedom, and that really speaks to me because, you know, I was from Alberta and I got a car right away as soon as I could, and so, and I still sort of associate that with my freedom and independence, but I have lived in places where I was more free and independent as a on public transit. And then so it's a sort of, there's a value base underneath it that we need to sort of, I think, have those other experiences to believe that we could have an uncar place. Although there are some, we have some huge challenges in terms of our sprawling cities, like Patrick mentioned LA and those giant sprawling, LA is mind-bogglingly massively full of single family developments, and at its own scale, Prince George is mind-bogglingly large for the number of people. It's, when you don't just think about the town, you think about the whole corporate boundary. That's a very big place. Okay, how are we doing here? So, oh yeah, the other thing that Ryan mentioned was being able to navigate that system even though you don't speak the language. So the word for that in urban design is called legibility. Like, that's like, can you read it? Can you, going into a place, read, understand where you're allowed to go, where you're not allowed to go, where you should go, where you shouldn't go? Can you read it? And when I lived in LA, it was a slightly different place, and I remember there was a lot more youth gang violence at the time. And when I did take my car back and forth from where I lived to the university, I drove through some neighborhoods where there often was a bunch of shooting going on. And I just tried to hunker down. But one of my cousins came to Los Angeles and was, touring around, and he's like, if I'm in a neighborhood where the cars look like the cars look in Winnipeg, I should not be in that neighborhood. So he was figuring out that the car, the signaling we do with what kind of car we have in Winnipeg, everybody drives these old junkers and nobody cares. But in LA, it's part of the whole statusy thing. It's also very much part of the legibility of the neighborhoods there, part of how you read neighborhoods. Anyway, I thought that was funny. But the concept of legibility, can you go into a place, and sometimes it's legibility for tourists and you want more of it. Sometimes it's just, can you understand yourself as a human being in this space? Is this space meant for human beings or is it meant for cars? You can understand that from a space. So the general word for that is how legible is the urban fabric, they usually say. So I want us to think about, because of course our assignment around this is going to be about systems. What systems affect or determine land use? So even in that little Caslow example there, you can see, I love Caslow because it's such a tiny town that you can use it for examples. You can see river, hills, and soils. You can see the physical geography affecting where the town is located, you know, water, transportation corridor, hill, and the pattern. Population and work economics, thinking more about, you know, northern places where the industrial economies are so often part of what shapes communities, as opposed to amenity economies, which are. How many of you have ever heard the word amenity economy before? Okay. So in our old school geography, you think, okay, well, we're going to have a mine there, so we're going to need a town there, so the workers have housing. And so that's the fundamental reason for a lot of locations. Or we have two rivers crossing there, and it has always been a transportation network. And we learned that from the first peoples. So we're going to put our settlements there. We're going to put our trading post there. So there's, you know, trade-based locations, transportation-based locations, and industrial-based locations. And now we have a thing called amenity-based locations. And that's where people just go live where they want to live. And so it started out with people wanting to commute with their personal planes to places like Banff, Canmore, or places in like Sandpoint, Idaho, places in Europe. So there's a word called amenity migration. And this is relevant for us in British Columbia because we have so many amenities like water and mountains. So anyway, it's a different economic geography, and one that we're not really used to thinking about. We're more used to thinking about workers and industries. The thing when we were talking about, would I choose to take the bus, or would I choose to have a car, or would I choose to be an enthusiastic transit rider? The systems of energy and time, you know, in our transportation choices, transportation, energy, and time costs. Sometimes, sometimes cities have a lot of defensive structures. It helps to explain their shape. Larger European cities typically they changed sometime around the 1700s, big massive plan changes to make sure you could get the army in to defend against citizen uprising. So that can shape a land use pattern. And then the one that I'm really talking about in the Caslow example, and the one that really comes into play in Prince George and in those single family housing, it's financial expectations, financial forecasts that individual households make. So if you think about using our imaginations about 2050, and you think about how individuals choose their household investments, are they really imagining? Do they imagine that anything is going to change demographically or economically? Or do they imagine or wish to imagine that the systems that have been in place since the 40s and 50s are just going to keep chugging along? This is a huge question for families, for you guys as you finish university and think, okay, am I gonna try to get a piece of that real estate? Am I gonna move somewhere where I can afford a single family home? And it's one of the big issues when people talk about how young generations can't afford home ownership. They're sometimes we're, I mean, it's true of condos as well. I was going to say they're talking about single family homes, but the image that you need to own real estate in order to be functioning member of society is a much older, it's a cultural thing. It's also an economic thing for the last few decades. It's been a fundamental investment for families. And if you just think about us as little investors generationally, your grandparents, so my parents, and generationally, the mainstream pattern has been, okay, well, if we get a little house and invest in that, and we could sell that off. But if we got a bigger house, we could sell that off, and homes get bigger, and things, developers, make these bigger lots and these expanses of lawn. And you look at those patterns and all the costs in them, and you're like, okay, well, we are doing this because we think it's going to bring us a sort of a satisfying image of how we live now and some future benefit. So, I'm in this situation right now where I'm thinking about real estate and thinking about what changes are going to come and thinking about investment and do you rent or buy? And so there's some interesting things just from an investment point of view. But if you think about, there's a sort of an inertia about those cultural expectations. You're like, what explains, how do we keep doing this, even though we know how costly it is from a greenhouse gas standpoint? Just realizing I didn't put that slide up. It's costly from a greenhouse gas standpoint, from a community tax standpoint. That land use pattern is expensive to maintain, to start and maintain. In terms of transportation, that land use pattern determines how many households there are per hectare. Even though you can intensify it, secondary suites, carriageway homes, and those are good strategies, that if you limit that to sort of doubling the density, probably because of what infrastructure you have in place, are you going to get to a place where you can have a better transportation system? But here we are, we have this giant, expensive infrastructure, and we need to intensify. And one of the readings, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself one slide. There's a whole bunch of those other costs. We've got to vote for Fort McMurray's case study in planning. Oh, Lord, that could go both ways. So I'm just reading the chat. Sorry, you guys. So what consequences does land use have on other material social systems? Obviously, it has a consequence on the energy systems, because it's a single family house. You got no shared walls. And depending on when it was built, that'll affect its energy performance. A lot of those big box stores and that part of that consumption infrastructure, sort of car-based retail consumption infrastructure, is very costly in terms of energy and land use. We talked about water last time. And on the economy / family social organization, if you have high cost housing, you need to have more wage earners per household. And there's so many households where that's maybe that's not possible. Maybe that's not what people want to do, is have everybody working. But housing is that high cost housing and our expectation of it as an investment is a real driver in that land use pattern.
Excuse me, Tara.
Yeah.
I just have a quick question, because as you're talking about all of this, it sort of makes me think about, and I'm not quite too sure what my question is yet, but just what you're talking about makes me think about the, I guess and I'm trying to be thoughtful about how I say this because I don't want to single out a group of people, but from my understanding, a lot of the issues that you have just spoken about have come along with generational expectations. So, like the baby boomers coming and buying up, 2, 3 houses. And so that kind of creates all these like sort of trickle down effects for younger generations like millennials. And I'm just sort of wondering, is there any kind of like, will we be having any conversations, or is there any space to have conversations about those generational sort of differences and how that impacts things like sustainability?
Well, I hadn't really thought about that but we can talk about it in the context of land use. Just personally, my parents are slightly older than baby boomers. So, well, actually, no, that's true. My aunt is a baby boomer. My parents are slightly older. So, economically, they rode that wave because the baby boomers is a giant demographic wave. And so it's actually a question in terms of our development patterns as that giant demographic wave, which has managed to accumulate a fair amount of wealth, although that's not true across the board. But some of them do own multiple houses, but at the very least, as they age, many of them are still in their single family home that no one else could afford to buy right now. And so as that giant wave starts to look for other housing options, what is actually going to happen to the price of single family real estate over the next 10 years? There's what's called an oversupply in many places. So you can just I just hear that from a land economics standpoint. And the reason I hear it that way is probably because I'm, looking at real estate right now. I'm like, But we do have a lot of systems, banking systems, country, that sort of the political financial interests of the government that would be interested in not having housing prices collapse when we go through the generation. But in terms of the broader question, the broader thing that it raises in your question, Ryan, I think is the different economic fortunes of the different demographic groups on the whole.
Yeah, and I really I apologize if I sounded like I was generalizing, but I guess these are just some of the conversations that I know that I've been hearing in other sort of areas, just in terms of, there is huge concern around what happens when the baby boomer generation starts to die off or age, which is happening now. But then also on the flip side of that, in looking at even accessibility to employment for the millennial generation because of baby boomers and their I guess for the most part people not leaving jobs, even if they're at retirement age and things like that. And so I just sort of, when I thought of the housing, that's other kind of conversations that I've heard, is that housing prices have been driven up because people who have been in that baby boomer kind of generation have had access to wealth to buy more than one house, even though they may not live in it, but rent it out and accumulate more wealth. And so, yeah, I just, I didn't want to generalize and say that all baby boomers have enormous amounts of wealth and enormous amounts of houses, but I've just heard of that as being a bit of a key issue in looking to future sort of understandings.
in looking at, in my housing work, the, obviously this aging baby boomer generation, just like they needed more classrooms when they were in school, and they need more, now they need more senior aging housing options, much as they wouldn't want to call it that. And I get to say they, because I'm like on the way tail end. I'm almost Generation X. Economically, I've always behaved as if I'm Generation X. But so we're going to need all these different kinds of housing. So one of the interesting and counterintuitive pieces about actual baby boomer households is there's a surprising percentage of the free love generation that does not have a penny to their name approaching retirement, like a surprising percentage of them. And I can't bring it to mind right now, but whose life savings and total wealth is like at retirement is like $3,000. Like, what did they do? They must have had a good time. So can everybody just check out Cameron's comment there? The belief in housing as a safe form of investment with good returns is a reinforcing system. So the implication, I think, Cameron, of what you're saying there is, if we think it, we will make it true. Is that what you're saying? Can you talk instead of typing?
I forgot to how to turn my mic on. I was just looking for it, and then I'm like, oh my God, I can't find it. I'll just type. Yeah, so what am I trying to say? Like, I agree with Ryan how like it was a generational issue, but it's funny because you were saying like, or at least it seemed like you were implying like you maybe thought housing prices were going to decline. But in all the popular literature I've read over the years, like people have been saying that for a very long time, but housing prices in Canada consistently continue and go up. And like some people blame money laundering, some people blame immigration, some people blame housing speculation. I guess it's a little bit of everything, but I really think it's that idea that people see housing as an investment vehicle. That's a higher priority, is seeing housing as just a place to live, right? And then again, that idea, that faith in housing as a form of investment just keeps reinforcing itself. And why don't we see housing prices drop, right? I mean, even now in the middle of the pandemic, we're not really seeing housing prices drop, right? So it's like a very, very strong reinforcing system going on there. I think PG, Prince George is a very affordable place to live, but I think we still see housing prices going up about 10% every single year, almost 10%. Correct me if I'm wrong.
And your point about housing prices going up in the pandemic, there was just an article in The Economist about that. How is it that housing prices are going up in the pandemic when you would think people had less money? I mean,
I think
that there's so many people who are one rise in percentage interest rate away from bankruptcy nationally, particularly in the big housing markets like Toronto and Vancouver. If they get into those housing markets, if the interest rate were to rise, they would lose those houses. They wouldn't be able to make the payments.
Yeah, I agree. I think people are kind of banking on the fact that the interest rates aren't going to rise also. And I'm probably going to forget some of my terminology here, but like housing is like a physical asset or whatever. And I think people, they want to move their wealth sort of out of bonds and stocks, and they want to put it in those physical assets because they're seen as safer. I think that has to do with like what people think like the inflation rate might be in the future. But yeah, I think people are also banking on the fact that interest rates will stay low, and everything I've seen so far seems to indicate they will. Like if you go look at what the Bank of Canada has been saying, there's no hint they're going to raise interest rates. So yeah.
Yeah. They there's a decision being made there about how important the financial stability of the consumers is.
Yeah, actually, and one more quick point too is like about the self-reinforcing nature of that sort of system is the fact that because so many individual Canadians, like I'm pretty sure it's you know, we talk about how like it's generational, but still it's the vast majority of Canadians own a home, I do believe. And so from the government's perspective, it's like, yeah, we could enact policy that might decrease the value of homes, but that's decreasing all those people's savings. And that has like a big wide ranging effect on the rest of the economy, right? So that's a pretty good way of how that system is self-reinforcing through the actual economy and not just like people's beliefs, right?
Right. Through the political economy, it's self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
But don't say not just people's beliefs, because that's what people buy a house on. It's what they believe it is worth.
Yeah, it's both for sure.
That's one of the things I find so interesting about land economics is if you were doing a land valuation from a commercial perspective or a rental perspective, you analyze what's the income out of that land, and that gives you your land, the value of the land to you. So, you know, if you're thinking about buying a mill or buying a shopping center or buying, you know, what's the rents, therefore you work backwards from there to what the value is. But people's beliefs around their homes have nothing to do with that. They just have these beliefs.
It's actually interesting that you brought up land evaluation, because something I've always been interested in studying more, but I literally never have, so I'm actually not very knowledgeable on it, is sort of like around property taxes. For example, I think here in Prince George, like a percentage of the property tax is based on the actual value of the land, but then I think a percentage of it is based on like what you develop on the land. And I've always been wondering about how like that might be tweaked, right? I always hear these arguments people make about how like we need to shift to a land value tax. I don't know enough about that to like really say anything, but I've always wanted to study that more because, for example, like if you're a private developer and you're just squatting on an empty lot in downtown, depending on how the property tax is determined, you know, that has a pretty strong effect on the development, right? Like, it might be better for you not to develop that land and just sit on it, let everyone else around you develop and then sell it later, right? So it's not something I know too much about, but it's something I've been interested in.
You know, I casually mentioned the word brownfields as I went through. Speaking of land valuation, a brownfield, the general word means, as opposed to a greenfield. A greenfield development is where you go and you develop land, or you make a subdivision or something on the edge of town on land that hasn't been developed before. So, but brownfield has another meaning, which is land that has some contamination on it. And just when you mentioned an empty lot downtown, if you think about that Caslow Bay example, that has at least 2 brownfield sites on it where there's lead contamination, probably, you know. So this actually has to do with your question. I just want to say that, or your comment about land value.
I think I see how you're getting there. Yeah.
Because if you have an empty lot, the property assessor will come along and assess you taxes based on, you know, they'll do what are similar lots worth. And so your lot is worth, you know, $500,000. But if a developer were to come along and look at it and they go, well, okay, so it'll cost me $500,000 to truck the lead away and send it to the moon. Then your land is worth 500,000 minus 500,000, which is 0. And so, but do you go and argue with the property assessor? No. And the reason you don't, if you have a brownfield, is because then someone will make you clean it up. So when you're looking around and you see empty lots and you're like, that's just sitting there. It could be a brownfield. And your interest, because of the regulatory structure around environmental contamination, you probably don't have an interest in talking about that with everybody, because you could be forced to clean it up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like when I mentioned a lot downtown, I actually didn't even have a specific lot in mind. So I wasn't even thinking about brownfields, but yeah, I totally agree. Like that's something you got to factor in. Maybe another example though of how we tax land affects development would be like in a residential neighborhood, for example. So depending on the percentage of your property tax, which is determined by what you sort of developed, it could disincentivize people to sort of improve their homes. So for example, if I spent $5,000 improving my home in some way, like building a fence or building a garden, that would increase my property tax, right? And I think every municipality might do it differently. So again, it's not something I'm too knowledgeable of, but it seems like there's an area or an opportunity for that to actually disincentivize people from sort of bettering their neighborhoods or making them nicer. But again, it's not something I've really studied. It's just something I've read on the side, and I haven't had time to really explore it.
I think that taxation used to have more of an effect on urban form than it does now. And the reason I say it, there's a whole housing form in the South in the United States. They're called shotgun houses. And sometimes the taxation, because here in British Columbia, we tax on property value generally, like the whole value, at least in the rural areas. Whereas in some places, and there's some ways we do this in British Columbia too, but how much frontage does your lot have? So in some places you'll get these narrower frontage lots based on the taxation system. And that has something to do with the shape of those lots in Kaslo that are 25 feet by 105 feet. Because there was some thought about property frontage being the basis for taxes. But in these old houses, you also have this housing form called shotgun houses, which are just houses that are built based on taxation being done on the frontage. And I think that has resulted in the reform of property taxation being done on the whole value. So you weren't just trying to look thin from the road.
Yeah, that's so odd how it can work like that.
It's totally a part of explaining land use pattern, absolutely. Yeah, finance is very important. So I don't have to run off like I did last week, but I'm feeling like we might be at our Zoom meeting tolerance. So what I think I'll do is I'll finish this lecture, which is kind of about some of the strategies of densification and intensification, and that's what the readings are about. If this is all right with you, I'll like finish this thing. I have the readings posted for the week already, and I have the discussion assignment. So I'll just like open up access to the module once I get the end of this lecture posted. Actually, I could do that. I could just open up the module, and I could open up the module right now before I have the lecture posted and just post this later in the day. Is anyone, on the other hand, if you wanna hang around and just talk land use patterns some more, sorry, I was enjoying the chat. Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna stop I'm still screen sharing, so it sounds like I'm gonna stop screen sharing, but I'm gonna actually stop screen sharing. So anyone that wants to just talk some more about land use patterns, you're welcome to stay, because I'm not doing this because I have to run away. But on the other hand, I think I'll stop doing this as a lecture, and I'll stop the record thing, which I had going to.
I had a question about the assignment due on the 27th.
Mm-hmm.
Systems conditions due. That was a solo one apart from the group.
Yeah, I thought that would be easier to manage. So let me. Why don't I just reshare?
Okay.
And come on. Okay. So what I'm wanting you to do is apply a land use and transportation lens. Like, what can you apply from all these system ideas I've been talking about, land use and transportation? What can you apply from that to what you're thinking about? And here I'm mind reading, but what you're thinking about for your final assignment. And I did it as an individual because, as an individual assignment, because no one has to try to figure out how to do that as a group, but you are more than welcome to strategize. The problem that you have is I haven't really said anything very clear about exactly what the final assessment is, or the final assignment is. What I'm aiming at is that we use strategic planning tools that we've already started to make. Like, we've made some scenarios, and we've all been thinking about different communities and systems, and we've been thinking about what the sustainability criteria are. And we're gonna try to go through a resilience assessment, what of a limited number of choices, how do these play out against these different scenarios? Because that's fundamentally the approach of strategic planning. And if you look at what Prince George has done with their sustainability plan, that's fundamentally the strategic planning approach they took. So that I'm trying to do a mini version of that. So in terms of, so back to what do we do this week? This is so vague yet. I want you to think about what we're talking about, land use and transportation systems, and how consequential they are for whether or not we can adapt to greenhouse gases, or to whether or not we can adapt to lessen climate change. And what would you strategically want to do that has the most relevance in terms of what your group is thinking?
Do you have any sort of possible examples that we could draw from so that there's less confusion? Because I'm yeah, I guess like maybe the questions like what's the format? How long? What's your expectations for the assignment?
Oh, it's just a discussion. It's just a discussion board entry. I'm sorry, that was an easy one. No, okay. So sometimes I give a word length like 250 words, or that's probably enough.
Is that the discussion board in the Google Docs that we should do it in?
I was thinking of just the discussion board on Blackboard.
It's not available. It's not there. The discussion, there's content announcements, mail, and help, and then the groups.
Well, it'll be, so if you look at content,
Okay.
I just haven't I haven't opened up the module for this week.
Okay.
I opened up the one with the Zoom link in it, but not the actual module with the readings linked and the assignment.
Okay.
So I will do that. Why don't I just do that? It's ready to go, and I just have to put the rest of this lecture in. So I'll do that right after class. I'll just make that module available.
Okay. And is it like 200 words, 500 words, an entire book? Like, what's kind of the
who's for an entire book? Huh. I was thinking 250, which I think about as like the thing I don't like about word counts is sometimes when I'm actually thinking about something, it's harder for me to write short than write long. And so what the real assignment is to think about how far there is to go in terms of reducing greenhouse gases from, if you look at the very first page of the brand new climate mitigation plan, or within the executive summary, the one for Prince George came out, I think it says 2020 on it. Over half of the emissions in the city of Prince George are transportation. then you look at, anyway, so yeah, but then you look at if you look at the sustainability plan, it doesn't actually say anything there about transportation and the transit and the future transit plan. I know I'm talking about documents that I've read that maybe you haven't, but what do we need to do to get from where we are to where we need to be? And so that's that's a strategic planning question. And so all I want you to do this week, let's say you were thinking about food systems in Prince George. If you guys could think, or if you individually thought about what kinds of land use changes, or how does the land use system put up barriers or make it easier to have a more sustainable food system? If you could just write about that, that will be helpful to you for your final assignment. It'll help you think about it.
Okay, thank you. That clarified. a lot.
Okay. I'm just